In this video, we're going to take a look at using Context API, which allows us to pass values deeply into our stack of components without having to manually pass them down every time. For example, we can define our context inside of our app, and we can access it in any of the components that app has, as well as any of the child components there. We can access it however deeply nested we want inside of app. It kind of works like a global variable that is only global to everything inside of app. Because global variables aren't really possible when you're using modules inside of React, so this is a really great way to do that without having to create an actual global variable or manually pass down the prop to every single child that needs it. So something like this that is really useful is using, for example, a theme. If you want to change the theme throughout your entire application, using something like a context allows you to pass that theme through everything without manually passing it every time. We just define our theme in our app, and we can use it anywhere we need our theme to be. So let's create a context that's actually going to be for a theme. And to do that, we actually just need to export a theme here. So we can just say export our theme context. Make sure we use const because it's actually a variable. And we just set this here equal to react.context. Whoops, create context. There we go. And what we do here is this is creating a context. And a context essentially has two portions to it. We have a provider and a consumer. The provider is allowing us to pass out a value. Essentially, it's providing a value to everything inside of it, and the consumer is just consuming that value. So let's look at how we actually set up the provider. What we need to do is we need to actually wrap all of the code we want to be able to access our context inside of it. So we can just say here, we have our theme context, and this is going to be our provider, and we want to make sure we close this off as well down here. So now all of our code inside of here is able to access our theme context.provider. But as you can see, we have an error, and that's because we need to make sure that we actually have a closing tag that is properly formatted. Whoops. Just like this. So there we go. So now we have no more error. And inside of our theme context.provider, what we need to do is we need to pass a value. This is just an attribute that this takes, and always it needs to be called value. And inside of the value, we're actually just going to pass down an object. So we're going to create an object, and inside of here, this is just going to be a style. So we're going to say background color, and we're going to set it equal to a variable, which we're going to call theme. And this is going to be some kind of state inside of our application. And that's because when you change your context, it doesn't actually re-render your application. You need to use state in order to re-render your application in order to change your context. So up here, since we're in a function component, we need to make sure we call our useState hook and actually set up another one of these. So we can say const, we first want our theme as well as our set theme. These are going to be the two returns from our useState hook. And by default, let's make our background color red. So we can just set our theme to red by default. And now we can just create a button down here, which is going to set our theme. So we can create a button, and it's going to have an onClick. And this onClick here is of course going to take a function. And this function is just going to set our theme, and it's just going to toggle our theme. So when we call set theme, we want to make sure we actually take in the previous theme, and we want to check that if the previous theme is equal to red, for example, then we want to run the code after here. So let's make sure we actually put this on a separate line and in a return statement, just so it's easier for you to read. And there we go. So what we want to do is we want to actually return the opposite color, which in our case is blue. We want to do this whenever the theme is red, and whenever it is not red, we want to return red, just like this. And the way that this syntax works is this is actually a ternary operator. So it says anything before the question mark is your true false statement. So if this is true, it executes everything between the question mark here and between the colon. Otherwise, it returns what after the colon. So if our previous theme is red, we return blue, and if it's not, we return red. Now, as you can see, we have an error, and that's just because we need to make sure we close off our button element, and we make sure we close off this version of the button element, and we can just put in here toggle theme. Now, when we save that, you see we have a toggle theme button, which every time we click it, it's going to change our state value for us. But right now, nothing is using our theme context, so we actually aren't changing the color of our buttons yet. So let's look at how we actually use our theme context inside of a class component. And unfortunately, inside of a class component, it's a bit harder to deal with context. So we're going to show you the hard way first, and then when we jump into our counter with hooks, you're going to see absolutely how much infinitely easier it is inside of hooks. So the first thing we need to do is we actually need to import that theme context. Theme context. And we need to make sure we import that from our app. So we can just import it from app here. So now we have our theme context. And what we need to do is we actually need to use the consumer portion of that theme context. So we can come in here with our theme context, and we want to make sure we use theme context.consumer. And inside of here, make sure we actually spell consumer correctly. There we go. And we could put all of our code inside of here, just like this. Make sure it's all indented properly. There we go. And immediately we're going to get an error. This isn't actually going to work. And that's because theme context consumer is actually going to be having a function inside of it. So we need to have a curly brace, and inside of this function, it's actually going to have a parameter, which is going to be whatever our value is. In our case, it's our style. It's this right here, the background color theme. So we're going to have our style. And then this function inside of here is actually going to return all of our different JSX that we actually want to render. So we can put our JSX inside of that function. Now when we save, you see it's actually not going to work. And that's because we need to make sure that we're actually returning this HTML inside of here. The easiest way to do that is to just make these normal parentheses, which is essentially saying return everything inside of the parentheses to the function. And now we're getting this error, and that's because up here, we actually need to make sure we import theme context this way, because this is not the default export. We actually want to get the named export of theme context. Now when we save, you'll see our application renders properly over here, and we have access to this style variable inside of all of this. So we can actually set the style of our button. For example, we can say the style here is going to be equal to that style. And this is just a style as if it was rendering random CSS. And for example, we set CSS here, background color to theme. So this should set the background color of our button to red by default. Let's paste that again down here. And as you can see, we get a red background color. And when we click toggle theme, it changes it to blue and back to red. And that's because we're changing our theme here with our set theme down here, where we're using state for that. And then what's happening is passing that into our context here as the theme value. And now everywhere it's being consumed, it's getting that updated value every time we click toggle theme. So now that we actually understand how to use this inside of a class component, let's jump over to hooks and see how much easier this really is. The first thing we need to do is input our hook that's going to allow us to use context, just like this. And it's so simple. All we do down here is we put a const with the name of our context value, which is theme, and we just say use context, and we need to pass it the context we want to use. So let's import that context, which is going to be theme context. And this is going to, of course, come from our app, just like this. And we pass that theme context into our use context, and now we have access to our theme. In our case, we called this style. So let's make sure we come down here and say style is equal to style. Do this for both of our buttons, and save. And magically, our counter hooks now has the exact same color changing buttons, and it was a single line change as opposed to this massively nested funky looking function syntax here with the theme context consumer. This is really the power of hooks and how much easier it makes it to do things. You do need to remember though that you have to use this at the top level. You can't use it nested deeply like with the other hooks such as use state. They all have that exact same restriction. And now one other thing to mention is if we go in and inspect our page here, look at our console, we have all of our different rendering being popped out. So when we refresh our page, it renders the entire application. And when we click our counter, it upgrades our counter. Over there here, it upgrades our counter hooks, but when we click toggle theme, you see it re-renders our app, our counter, and our counter hooks. And that's because app has the children of counter and counter hooks inside of it that both need to be re-rendered when the app is re-rendered because they both rely on this value from the theme context provider. So React is smart enough to re-render these children as well as the component app whenever you're changing the theme inside of the app. And that's really the basics of context. As you can see, we didn't actually need to pass our theme in as props, and that's really the power of context, because when you're using context, most of the time you're going to be using it inside of a very deeply nested child hierarchy. So for example, we'll have a counter, and inside that counter, we may have another component, and that component is called fancy button. And in that component, we may have another component. And that final component, all the way down there, 3 levels deep, is what needs to access this theme context consumer. And we don't actually need to worry about passing it through the props. We can just access it exactly where it's needed. Especially in the counter hooks example, you can see how easy it is to access that variable. Now that we actually understand how React works, and we understand what class components are, function components, state, props, hooks, context, all of that stuff that we learned in the last few videos, which has been quite a lot, we're actually going to take our application and deploy it using Netlify and GitHub, which will give us a really nice continuous deployment environment that we can easily use inside of our application for the rest of this course. So I really hope you're excited about that because it's incredibly easy to set up. So I'll see you in the next video.